Supermarket employee humiliates humble elderly woman for paying with coins, unaware that George Starit is next in line. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Harris grocery store, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors. It was 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday, that peculiar time when the after-work rush began to trickle in. A steady stream of tired faces and shopping carts filled with last-minute dinner ingredients. For most shoppers, it was just another errand to check off their list before heading home. For Eleanor Morgan, however, grocery shopping was an expedition that required careful planning and even more careful budgeting. Eleanor stood in the bread aisle, her weathered hands gripping the handle of her small wire basket. At 78 years old, she had developed a system for shopping that accommodated her arthritic fingers and limited income. Every Thursday, she would walk the 6 blocks from her small apartment to Harris Grocery, meticulously selecting only what she absolutely needed for the week ahead. Today, her basket contained a half-gallon of milk, a small package of ground beef that was on sale, a loaf of white bread and a few cans of soup. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Reaching into the pocket of her faded blue cardigan, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of her coin purse. The Social Security check that had arrived earlier that week had mostly gone toward her rent and utilities, leaving precious little for food. Still, she had managed to save enough coins over the past month to afford these few necessities, counting out each penny and nickel with painstaking precision at her kitchen table the night before. Just enough, she whispered to herself, a small victory in the constant battle against poverty that had become her life since Albert's passing 3 years ago. Her husband had always handled their finances, and his sudden heart attack had left her not only heartbroken, but also woefully unprepared for the harsh realities of surviving on a single fixed income. As Eleanor made her way toward the checkout lanes, she rehearsed the total in her mind, $17.43 if she had calculated correctly. The coins in her purse amounted to exactly $18, leaving her with a cushion of 57 cents. Not much, but every penny counted these days. The store was growing busier, the after-work crowd now filling the aisles with their hurried movements and impatient sighs. Eleanor moved slowly, careful not to bump into anyone or drop her precious items. She had learned to make herself small, to stay out of the way of those with more important places to be. By the time she reached the checkout area, all 6 lanes were open, each with a line at least 3 customers deep. Eleanor scanned the checkout lanes, looking for the shortest line, or better yet, a familiar face. Some of the cashiers knew her, greeting her with genuine smiles and patience as she counted out her coins. Today, however, she didn't recognize any of the cashiers working the registers. With a small sigh, she made her way to lane 4, where only 2 people waited ahead of her. The young man operating the register couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. His name tag read Jason, and he processed each transaction with a practiced efficiency that bordered on mechanical. His dark hair was styled in that messy way that young people seem to prefer these days, and he wore a series of small silver rings on his fingers that clicked against the register keys as he worked. As Eleanor waited, she couldn't help but notice the way Jason interacted with the customers ahead of her. His responses were short, his smiles forced and fleeting. He barely made eye contact, focusing instead on scanning items as quickly as possible, as if engaged in some private race against time. When a customer asked where to find an item in the store, Jason's answer was a curt, "Aisle 7, without looking up from the register. The line behind Eleanor grew longer, and she could feel the collective impatience building. By the time it was her turn, at least 5 people stood behind her, their carts filled with far more groceries than her modest basket. Self-conscious about holding up the line, Eleanor placed her items on the conveyor belt with trembling hands. "Hello," she said softly. offering a small smile that wasn't returned. Jason began scanning her items without acknowledging her greeting. Beep, beep, beep. The harsh electronic sound punctuated the silence between them. When he finished, he finally looked at her, his expression making it clear that this was just another transaction to process, another customer to move along. 1743, he said flatly, already looking past her to the next person in line. Eleanor nodded, setting her basket aside and reaching into her cardigan pocket for her coin purse. The clasp stuck slightly, as it often did, and she had to work at it with her arthritic fingers. She could feel Jason watching her, his impatience radiating across the counter. "I have it exact," she said, hoping to reassure him as she finally opened the purse. "Just need to count it out." Jason sighed loud enough for those nearby to hear. He drummed his fingers on the counter, the metallic clicking of his rings creating a rhythm that seemed designed to hurry her along. Eleanor's hands betrayed her, trembling more pronouncedly now as she felt the pressure of being watched, judged. She began counting out the coins she had so carefully organized that morning. Quarters first, then dimes, nickels, and finally the pennies. 1, 2, 3. She counted softly, placing each quarter carefully on the counter to avoid dropping any. But as she reached for the dimes, her fingers fumbled and several coins scattered across the counter and onto the floor. "Oh dear," she whispered, mortified. "I'm so sorry." Jason made no move to help her. Instead, he leaned back and crossed his arms, making a show of checking his watch. "Seriously?" he muttered, loudly enough for others to hear. From behind her, Eleanor heard someone sigh heavily. Another customer murmured something about express lanes and senior hours. Heat rose to her cheeks as she bent down with considerable effort to retrieve the fallen coins. "Ma'am, we have a line forming," Jason said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Can't you use a card like everyone else?" Eleanor straightened up slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of shame and indignation. "I don't have a card," she replied quietly. "Just my coins. I'll be quick." Jason rolled his eyes dramatically. "Nobody pays with coins anymore. This isn't the 1950s. The comment stung, aimed precisely at the generational gap between them. Eleanor felt her eyes beginning to water, but she blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in public. With renewed focus, she continued counting her coins, trying to ignore the growing tension around her. $7, she announced, having placed all her quarters on the counter. She moved on to the dimes, her fingers pinching each one with determination. Jason sighed again, louder this time, and turned to make eye contact with the next customer in line, as if sharing in their mutual suffering. "At this rate, we'll be here until closing," he remarked sarcastically. A few customers chuckled, emboldening Jason further. "Maybe we should call a museum to see if they want to display these ancient coins," he added, his voice carrying down the line. Eleanor's face burned with humiliation. She kept her eyes fixed on her coins, refusing to look up at the faces she knew were staring at her. $10, 11, 12. She continued counting, each coin representing a small sacrifice, a careful choice made to ensure she could eat this week. "Tick-tock, Grandma," Jason said, tapping his watch. "Some of us have plans tonight that don't involve counting pennies." Eleanor's hands froze momentarily, a dime pinched between her trembling fingers. She had been called many things in her life, wife, mother, teacher, widow, but never before had Grandma been wielded as an insult, a dismissal of her very personhood. She placed the dime down with the others and continued, determined to finish with whatever dignity she could salvage. Unbeknownst to both Eleanor and Jason, a tall figure had joined the line 3 customers back. Dressed in a simple blue plaid shirt, jeans, and a beige Stetson pulled low over his eyes, George Starit had entered Harris Grocery looking for nothing more than a couple of steaks and some beer for a quiet evening at home. His tour bus had broken, down just outside of town, and while his crew worked on repairs, he had decided to take advantage of the unexpected free time to grab some provisions. At 67 years old, George Strait was a legend in country music, with more #1 hits than any artist in any genre. Yet despite his fame and success, he had managed to maintain a private life away from the spotlight, grounded in the same values of respect, hard work, and common decency that had been instilled in him growing up in Pearsall, Texas. He had purposely chosen the busiest time to shop, hoping the crowd would make it less likely for him to be recognized. As he stood in line, George observed the interaction between the young cashier and the elderly woman with increasing concern. He had been raised to respect his elders, a value that seemed sadly absent in the young man behind the register. Each snide remark from the cashier made George's jaw tighten a little more, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Eleanor had managed to count out $15.25 when Jason decided he'd had enough. "Look, lady," he said, his voice sharp and cutting, "there's an ATM outside. Why don't you go get some real money and come back when you're ready? To shop in the 21st century." A collective intake of breath came from those close enough to hear. While many in line had been impatient, the cashier had crossed a line from merely rude to openly cruel. Eleanor's hands began to shake so badly that she dropped several more coins, which rolled across the counter and fell to the floor with tiny metallic sounds that seemed to echo her embarrassment. I'm sorry," she stammered, tears now freely streaming down her face. "This is all I have. Please, I just need to finish counting." Jason looked at her with undisguised contempt. "Well, while you're picking up your piggy bank from the floor, the rest of us will just grow old waiting, I guess." "Hey!" a woman 2 spots behind Eleanor called out. "There's no need to be nasty." Jason shot her a look. "Mind your own business. I'm just doing my job." "Your job is to be respectful to customers," another voice chimed in. Jason rolled his eyes again. "Whatever. Some of us have places to be." Eleanor had managed to retrieve most of the fallen coins and was desperately trying to remember where she'd left off in her count. I think I was at $15.25, came a deep, steady voice from further back in the line. The lady was at $15.25. The voice carried a distinct Texas drawl and a quiet authority that seemed to command attention. Heads turned as George Strait stepped forward, removing his hat as he approached the checkout counter. There was a moment of stunned silence as recognition dawned on those present. Jason's eyes widened slightly, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "Look, I don't care who's counting. I just need her to hurry up or move aside." George ignored, him instead moving to stand beside Eleanor. "Ma'am," he said gently, "may I help you with those coins?" Eleanor looked up, confused and overwhelmed by the sudden intervention. She didn't recognize George Strait. Her musical tastes ran more to Perry Como and Frank Sinatra. But there was something in his kind eyes and respectful demeanor that offered a life raft in the sea of humiliation she was drowning in. Yes, thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. George nodded and carefully gathered the remaining coins from her purse. With steady hands, he continued where she had left off, counting out loud, clearly and deliberately. $15.25, 50, 75, $16, 16.25, 16.50, 16.75, $17, 17.25, 17.50. He placed the final coins on the counter, then looked directly at Jason. "That should cover the $17.43, with 7 cents to spare." His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of steel that made Jason shift uncomfortably. Jason quickly scooped up the coins, no longer making any comments about their antiquity or inconvenience. He punched a few buttons on the register, and the drawer sprung open with a loud ching. "Do you need a bag, ma'am?" George asked Eleanor, who nodded gratefully. Jason hastily bagged Eleanor's groceries, avoiding eye contact with both her and George. He handed the bag over without a word, along with the receipt. "Thank you for your patience," George said to Jason, his tone making it clear that he had observed the complete lack thereof. Then, turning to Eleanor, he added, "May I walk you to your car, ma'am?" Eleanor clutched her grocery bag to her chest like a shield. I walked here," she admitted softly. George nodded thoughtfully. "Then may I have the honor of escorting you home? These groceries look heavy for a long walk." The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt that this wasn't charity or pity, but genuine respect. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before nodding. "That would be very kind, thank you." Now, as they turned to leave, George paused and looked back at Jason, who was already scanning items for the next customer, though his previous swagger had been replaced by a subdued efficiency. "Young man," George said, his voice carrying throughout the now silent checkout area, "a word of advice. All eyes turned to the country music legend, whose normally jovial face was set in serious lines." Jason looked up reluctantly, a flicker of defiance still visible beneath his embarrassment. "The true measure of a person isn't how they treat their equals or their betters," George said. "It's how they treat those they believe can do nothing for them. Remember that next time you're tempted to humiliate someone just trying to get by." With that, George gently guided Eleanor toward the exit, leaving behind a checkout area filled with whispers and the unmistakable weight of a lesson learned. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Eleanor clutched her grocery bag, still processing what had just happened. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, looking up at the tall stranger who had come to her rescue. "That was the most humiliating experience of my life until you stepped in." George smiled kindly. "No thanks necessary, ma'am. My mother would have tanned my hide if I'd stood by and let that continue." He adjusted his hat. "Now, which way are we headed?" Eleanor pointed down the street. 6 blocks that way. But really you don't have to." "I insist," George interrupted gently. "Besides, I could use the walk after being cooped up on a tour bus all day." As they began walking, Eleanor looked at him curiously. "Tour bus? Are you somebody famous?" George chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to chase away the lingering humiliation of the grocery store encounter. "Some folks might say so. Name's George Starit. I sing country music." Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition, though the name itself meant little to her. "Oh, I see. I don't listen to much country music, I'm afraid." She paused, then added with a small smile, "My late husband Albert, he enjoyed it, though." George nodded, unbothered by her lack of recognition. If anything, it was refreshing. "What kind of music do you enjoy, Mrs. Morgan?" "Eleanor Morgan," she replied. "And I'm more of a Sinatra girl myself. The classics." "Can't argue with old Blue Eyes," George said with a genuine smile. He knew how to tell a story with a song, just like the best country artists. And as they walked, George subtly slowed his naturally long stride to accommodate Eleanor's more measured pace. He also gently took the grocery bag from her, ignoring her protests. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, the awkwardness of their initial meeting fading with each block. "I hope you don't mind me asking, Miss Morgan, but do you make this walk every week for groceries?" George inquired, noting how the 6 blocks they'd covered had already taken nearly 20 minutes. Eleanor nodded. "Every Thursday. The senior shuttle only runs on Mondays and Fridays, and those are my doctor appointment days. So Thursday it is, rain or shine." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "The exercise is good for me anyway." George considered this, admiring her determination while feeling concerned about the burden such a journey must place on her aging body. "And you always pay with coins?" he asked gently, careful not to sound judgmental. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly. "Not always," she admitted, "but Social Security only goes so far these days. Sometimes I save my change in a jar all month, long, just to make sure I can get through the last week before the next check comes." They turned onto a quieter residential street lined with modest apartment buildings. Many had seen better days, with fading paint and small patched areas where repairs had been made piecemeal over the years. "That's my building there," Eleanor said, pointing to a 3-story walk-up with a small, concreted courtyard out front where several plastic chairs had been arranged in a rough circle. An elderly man sat in one, smoking a cigarette and watching them approach with undisguised curiosity. "Third floor?" George asked, noticing her slight breathlessness as they approached. Eleanor nodded. "Apartment 3C. The rent's cheaper for the walk-ups." She sighed. "Though these old knees protest more each year." They entered the building, and George found himself in a narrow hallway with worn carpet and walls that had once been white but had yellowed with age. A smell of boiled cabbage and disinfectant hung in the air. The stairwell was narrow, with a handrail that wobbled slightly when Eleanor gripped it. "Careful there," George said, steadying her with his free hand. "This railing's seen better days." "Like all of us here," Eleanor replied with a soft laugh. "We're all just holding on as best we can." As they made their way up the stairs, taking them slowly one at a time, George felt a growing sense of disquiet. He had grown up with modest means himself, but his success had insulated him from this kind of daily struggle for decades. Seeing Eleanor's reality up close was a stark reminder of how many people lived on the margins, invisible to those more fortunate. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Eleanor was winded, and even George felt the burn in his legs. He couldn't imagine making this climb carrying groceries at her age, yet she did it every week, without complaint. "Here we are," she said, fishing a key from her cardigan pocket. The door to 3C was distinguished from its neighbors only by a small wreath, made of artificial flowers. Eleanor unlocked the door and pushed it open, gesturing for George to follow her inside. The apartment was small but immaculately clean. A combined living room and dining area opened directly off the entryway, with a tiny galley kitchen visible. Beyond, family photos in simple frames adorned every available surface, and a well-worn armchair sat beside a small television that looked to be at least 20 years old. The weekly grocery deliveries arrived like clockwork every Thursday, bringing not just food, but a newfound sense of security. No more long walks with heavy bags, no more painful climbs up 3 flights of stairs while clutching packages that threatened to slip from her arthritic hands. No more counting coins at the kitchen table, anxiously calculating whether she could afford both bread and milk in the same week. But beyond these practical improvements, Eleanor found herself experiencing something she hadn't felt in years: anticipation. Twice a week, like clockwork, George would call her from whatever city his tour had taken him to. Their conversations ranged from the mundane details of daily life to deeper discussions about books they'd read or memories they cherished. Despite the difference in their ages and backgrounds, they had discovered a natural ease in their friendship, a comfortable rhythm that felt both surprising and inevitable. On this particular Thursday evening, Eleanor sat in her armchair, the telephone placed expectantly on the small table beside her. George had mentioned during their last call that he would phone around 7 after a sound check for that night's performance in Atlanta. The clock read 6:55. Eleanor smoothed her cardigan and touched her hair, a gesture that made her smile at her own foolishness. It was a phone call, after all. George couldn't see her. Yet there was something about these conversations that made her want to present her best self, if only in voice. At precisely 7 o'clock, the phone rang. Eleanor answered on the second ring, not wanting to appear too eager. "Hello? Eleanor, how are you this evening?" George's warm voice came through the line, tinged with the slight echo that she had come to associate with calls from large venues. "I'm well, George. How was the sound check? Is Atlanta treating you kindly?" George chuckled. "Sound check went fine, though the acoustics in this place are always a challenge. As for Atlanta, it's as hot and humid as I remember. How was your day? Did the grocery delivery arrive on time?" Eleanor smiled, settling back into her chair. "Right on schedule. That young man, Travis, is so courteous. He even offered to change a light bulb in the hallway that had been out for weeks. The landlord never got around to it, despite my calls." "Good man," George commented. "Listen, Eleanor, I wanted to run something by you. I've been thinking about your situation and others like yours." Eleanor felt a slight tension creep into their comfortable exchange. While she had accepted the grocery deliveries as an extension of their friendship, she remained wary of anything that might feel like charity or worse, pity. "What kind of something?" she asked cautiously. George seemed to sense her hesitation. "Nothing that would make you uncomfortable, I promise. It's actually a project I'm considering. After meeting you and learning about your circumstances, I've been thinking about how many other seniors might be in similar situations, managing on fixed incomes, facing physical challenges with everyday tasks, maybe feeling a bit isolated." Eleanor relaxed slightly. "There are many of us, that's certainly true. Just in my building, there's Mr. Ramirez downstairs, who can barely manage his diabetes medication costs, and Mrs. Chan on the second floor, who hasn't seen her grandchildren in California for 3 years because she can't afford the airfare." "Exactly," George said, his voice animated with purpose. "I've been blessed in my career, Eleanor. More money than I could spend in 2 lifetimes. I've always tried to give back through various charities, but after meeting you, well, I want to do something more specific, more targeted." Eleanor listened as George outlined his idea, a foundation focused on supporting seniors living independently, on limited incomes. It would provide practical assistance, grocery deliveries, transportation to medical appointments, home repairs, as well as opportunities for social connection and community engagement. "The thing is," George continued, "I want this to be done right, and for that I need input from the very people it's meant to serve. Would you be willing to be a consultant of sorts? Help me understand what would make the biggest difference in people's lives." Eleanor was silent for a moment, processing the request. "You want my advice on how to set up a charity?" "Not just a charity," George corrected gently. "A comprehensive support network. And yes, your advice would be invaluable. You've lived the reality, Eleanor. You know what works and what doesn't, what helps and what hurts people's dignity. That's expertise I don't have." Put that way, Eleanor couldn't deny the logic. She thought about her neighbors, friends from her teaching days, members of her church congregation, all aging, many struggling, some too proud to ask for help, even when desperately needed. "I'd be honored to help, George," she finally said, "though I'm not sure how much use an old school teacher will be in such grand plans." "More than you know," George assured her. "Now there's something else I wanted to discuss." As their conversation continued, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose growing within her. For years after retirement, she had felt increasingly invisible, her knowledge and experience seemingly irrelevant in a rapidly changing world. Now, unexpectedly, those very experiences were being valued, sought after. "I'll be finishing up this leg of the tour next week," George was saying. "I've got about 10 days off before we start the Western States. I was thinking of flying into town for a few days, meeting with some potential partners for this project. Would you be willing to sit in on those meetings? Share your perspective directly?" Eleanor's heart quickened at the prospect. Yes, I suppose I could, though I have nothing suitable to wear for important meetings," she added, glancing toward her modest closet visible through the bedroom door. George laughed warmly. "Don't you worry about that. Just be your forthright, insightful self. That's All we need. After they had said their goodbyes, with George promising to call again on Sunday, Eleanor sat in her quiet apartment, replaying the conversation in her mind. From a chance encounter in a grocery store to becoming an advisor on a charitable foundation, life had certainly taken an unexpected turn. The next morning, Eleanor was awakened by a knock at her door. Glancing at the clock, it was barely 8:30. She rose quickly, worried it might be Mrs. Peterson from next door, who occasionally needed help with her medication. Instead, she opened the door to find a smartly dressed young woman holding a large flat box and a garment bag. "Mrs. Eleanor Morgan?" the woman asked with a professional smile. "Yes, that's me," Eleanor confirmed, bewildered. "I'm Angela from Personal Stylist Services. Mr. Starit arranged for a delivery." She held out the items. "May I come in? These should be tried on to ensure proper fit." Still processing this unexpected development, Eleanor stepped aside to allow Angela entry. Inside, the young woman efficiently unpacked the box and garment bag, revealing a tasteful navy blue suit, a cream silk blouse, and a pair of low-heeled leather pumps that looked both elegant and comfortable. "Mr. Starit mentioned you had some important meetings coming up," Angela explained as she laid out the clothing. "He suggested these pieces would be appropriate while ensuring your comfort was the priority." Eleanor touched the fabric of the blouse, feeling its quality beneath her fingertips. "This is very generous, but I can't possibly—" Angela smiled understandingly. "He mentioned you might say that. He asked me to tell you it's not a gift, but rather appropriate business attire for a valuable consultant," his exact words. Eleanor couldn't help but laugh. George had anticipated her objections and found a way to frame his generosity that preserved her dignity. It was becoming a pattern in their unusual friendship. The suit fit as if it had been custom-made, which Eleanor suspected it might have been, though she didn't ask. Angela also produced a simple pearl necklace and earrings that complemented the outfit perfectly. "There's one more thing," Angela said, reaching into her bag. She produced a small, rectangular device. "Mr. Starit asked that you take this cell phone. It's already programmed with his number, and he's taken the liberty of adding a car service app so you can arrange transportation to the meetings." Eleanor accepted the phone hesitantly. "I've never used one of these before. My landline has always been sufficient." Angela spent the next 30 minutes patiently showing Eleanor the basics of using the smartphone. By the time she left, Eleanor felt both overwhelmed and strangely exhilarated. At 78, she was learning something entirely new, stepping into a world that had previously seemed designed to exclude people her age. Later that afternoon, Eleanor decided to test her new knowledge. Following Angela's instructions, she tapped the green phone icon, then George's name. The phone began to make a strange ringing sound, different from her landline. "Eleanor?" George's voice came through after just 2 rings. "Did Angela help you get set up with everything?" "She did," Eleanor confirmed, still marveling at the small device in her hand. "Though I feel rather silly, a woman my age learning to use this technology." "Nonsense," George countered firmly. "Age has nothing to do with it. It's just a tool, like anything else." "Did the suit fit all right?" "Perfectly," Eleanor admitted, "though I suspect you had something to do with that." "How did you know my size?" George's laugh came through the speaker, warm and genuine. "I have a good eye for these things. In part of the job, judging distances on stage, knowing exactly where to stand in relation to the microphone, that sort of thing." Eleanor knew he was being evasive, but decided not to press the issue. Likely he had asked someone, perhaps the grocery delivery service, to estimate her size. The thought should have bothered her, but somehow it didn't. George's consideration had been so consistent that she trusted his intentions completely. "I've arranged for us to meet with a financial advisor and a social worker next Wednesday," George continued. They've both had experience setting up foundations, like the one we're discussing. I thought we could hear their perspectives, then you could share yours. How does that sound? That sounds very sensible, Eleanor replied, relaxing into the conversation. Though I still think you're overestimating my input. And I think you're underestimating it, George countered gently, which is exactly why we need it. After they'd chatted a few minutes more, Eleanor ended the call following the instructions Angela had given her. She set the phone carefully on her coffee table and gazed at the suit hanging on her closet door. It had been years since she'd had any reason to dress formally. Her retirement from teaching had coincided with Albert's first heart attack, and their social life had diminished. Rapidly after that, limited by his health concerns and later by financial constraints. The thought of Albert brought a familiar pang. What would he think of all this? He had always been so proud, so determined to provide for her without outside help. Would he see George's intervention as an insult to his provision? Or would he be grateful that someone was looking after his beloved wife in his absence? Eleanor liked to think it would be the latter. Albert had been practical as well as proud. Being stubborn at the expense of sense isn't strength, it's foolishness, he used to say. And there was nothing foolish about accepting help when it was offered with respect rather than condescension. As the days passed, Eleanor found herself increasingly engaged in the details of George's proposed foundation. She made notes about services that might be most valuable, based on her own experiences and those of her fellow seniors. She thought about the isolation that came with age and limited mobility, the challenges of navigating healthcare systems, designed for the digitally savvy, the small daily indignities that accumulated when the world moved too fast for aging bodies to keep pace. By the time Wednesday arrived, Eleanor had filled a small notebook with observations and suggestions. Dressed in her new suit, her silver hair neatly styled, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for too long. When the car service arrived, a black sedan with a courteous driver who helped her in and out of the vehicle, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows their worth. The meeting was held in a private room at a downtown hotel. George was already there when she arrived, dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt, but still commanding the space with his presence. He rose immediately when she entered, crossing the room to greet her with a warm handshake that turned into a brief, gentle hug. "Eleanor, you look wonderful," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "Thank you for coming." She smiled, feeling surprisingly at ease despite the unfamiliar surroundings. "Thank you for asking me. I hope I can contribute something useful." "I have no doubt you will," George assured her, guiding her to a comfortable chair at the table. "Let me introduce you to Adrienne Lopez, a social worker specializing in elder services, and Michael Carter, a financial advisor who's helped set up several charitable foundations." As Eleanor shook hands with the two professionals, she noticed they treated her with genuine respect rather than the condescending patience she sometimes encountered from younger people. George's introduction had positioned her as a peer, a consultant with valuable expertise, not as a charity case or token elderly person. "Before we begin," George said, taking his seat across from Eleanor, "I want to be clear about my vision here. This isn't about creating something with my name plastered all over it. It's about establishing a sustainable support network for seniors who want to maintain their independence but need some practical assistance to do so." Eleanor has graciously agreed to share her insights as someone who understands these challenges firsthand. Adrienne nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach. Too many celebrity foundations fail because they're more about ego than impact." "Well, I've got no interest in that," George said firmly. "What I want is results." As the meeting progressed, Eleanor found her initial nervousness fading. When she spoke, the others listened attentively. Her suggestions were noted, her concerns addressed, By the end of the 2-hour session, a preliminary framework had emerged for what would eventually become the Dignity First Foundation, though the name would come later, suggested by Eleanor herself. As the sedan pulled away from the hotel, Eleanor sat in comfortable silence beside George, mentally reviewing the meeting they'd just concluded. A sense of accomplishment warmed her, different from anything she'd felt since retirement. For years, she had been adjusting to diminishment of health, of financial security, of relevance. Now, unexpectedly, her world was expanding again. "Penny for your thoughts," George said, his voice pulling her from her reverie. Eleanor smiled. "I was just thinking how strange life is. A month ago, I was counting coins for groceries and being humiliated by a cashier. Today, I'm helping design a program that might actually make a difference for people like me." She shook her head in wonderment. "All because you happen to be in that checkout line." George considered this. "I'm not sure it was just happenstance. Eleanor, my mother used to say that the good Lord puts people in our path for a reason. Maybe I needed to be reminded of what real courage looks like." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Courage? I don't follow. Getting up every day, facing a world that often treats you as invisible, making that walk to the grocery store despite aching knees, counting out those coins despite knowing you might face ridicule, that takes courage," George explained. "I sing songs about bravery and perseverance, but you live it. That's worth remembering." A comfortable silence fell between them as the car navigated the afternoon traffic. Finally, George spoke again. "I hope you don't mind, but I've made dinner reservations for us. Nothing fancy, just a place I've always enjoyed when I'm in town. I thought we could celebrate a successful meeting." Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not dressed." "You're dressed perfectly," George interrupted gently. "It's not the kind of place with dress codes or pretensions, just good food and privacy." 20 minutes later, the car pulled up outside Antonio's, a small Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street. Despite its unassuming exterior, Eleanor recognized the name. It was well regarded, the kind of place she and Albert might have visited for a special anniversary in their more comfortable days. The maître d' greeted George with the warm familiarity of an old acquaintance, but without the fawning deference celebrities often received. They were shown to a secluded booth in the back, where the lighting was warm and the noise level allowed for easy conversation. "Mr. Starit, always a pleasure," the maître d' said, handing them menus. "And Mrs. Morgan, welcome to Antonio's." Eleanor was surprised to be addressed by name, but quickly realized George must have mentioned her when making the reservation. It was another small courtesy, ensuring she felt expected and welcomed rather than like an afterthought. After they had ordered, George recommended the veal marsala, which Eleanor chose. They fell into the easy conversation that had characterized their phone calls. There was no awkwardness, no strain to find topics. They discussed books they'd recently read, shared stories about their grandchildren, debated the merits of classic films versus modern ones. "You mentioned your son lives in Seattle," George asked as their appetizers arrived. Eleanor nodded, spreading a small amount of roasted garlic on a piece of crusty bread. "Yes, Thomas is a software engineer, very successful, very busy. He calls weekly, visits when he can, though that's not often." There was no bitterness in her tone, just the resigned understanding of a parent whose child had built a life far away. "And your daughter?" George inquired delicately, remembering their previous conversation about Amy's struggles. Eleanor's expression softened with sadness. "The last I heard, she was in Phoenix. That was 6 months ago. She calls occasionally, usually when she's doing well. Silence usually means a relapse." She met George's eyes directly. 23 years of addiction. You reach a point where hope becomes a discipline more than a feeling." George nodded, respect evident in his gaze. A wise way of looking at it. and a brave one. As their main courses arrived, Eleanor decided to shift the conversation away from personal difficulties. "Tell me about your grandchildren. Are they musical like their grandfather?" George's face lit up, as it always did when discussing his family. "My grandson is showing some interest in the guitar, though at 9 years old, it's hard to tell if it's genuine passion or just wanting to be like his papa. My granddaughter now, she's the real firebrand, only 7, but she's already writing little songs and demanding everyone listen." "The creative spirit shows early," Eleanor observed, smiling at his obvious pride. "I could always tell which of my 4th graders had that spark." And they continued exchanging stories throughout the meal, which was everything George had promised. Excellent food served without pretension or intrusion. When they finally finished their coffee, Eleanor realized they had spent nearly 2 hours at the table. "I've kept you too long," she said, suddenly conscious of the time. "You must have other obligations." George shook his head. "Not tonight. My only plans were this meeting and dinner with you." He smiled warmly. "It's been the most enjoyable evening I've had in quite some time, Eleanor." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt a blush rise to her cheeks. At 78, she wouldn't have thought herself capable of such a reaction. "I've enjoyed it too," she admitted, "more than I expected." On the drive back to her apartment, George brought up a subject that had been mentioned briefly during their meeting. Adrienne suggested that a personal story might help people connect with the mission of the foundation. "She thought your experience might be powerful if shared." Eleanor frowned slightly. "My experience with that cashier, you mean?" "Partly that, but more broadly, your journey since Albert's passing. The challenges of maintaining independence while facing financial constraints." George glanced at her, gauging her reaction. "Only if you were comfortable, of course, and only the parts you chose to share." Eleanor considered this in silence. Her first instinct was to decline. Her struggles were private, her dignity hard-won. The thought of exposing her vulnerabilities, even for a good cause, made her uneasy. Yet as she reflected further, another perspective emerged. How many others were facing similar circumstances, feeling alone in their struggles? Might her story offer not just awareness for donors, but also recognition and solidarity for those living through similar situations? "I'll think about it," she finally said. "I can see the value, but I'd need to be sure it was presented with dignity, not as an object of pity." George nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right approach. Take all the time you need." When they arrived at her apartment building, George insisted on walking her to her door, despite her protests that it wasn't necessary. As they climbed the 3 flights of stairs, George again noting the precarious handrail, Eleanor found herself wishing the evening didn't have to end. It had been years since she'd enjoyed such stimulating company, such a sense of being truly seen and heard. At her door, Eleanor turned to face him. "Thank you for everything, George. Not just dinner, but for making me feel valued. It's been too long since I've felt that way." George's eyes held hers for a moment. "The feeling is mutual, Eleanor. Your perspective, your wisdom, they're valuable. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." With a gentle squeeze of her hand, he bid her good night and headed back down the stairs. Eleanor entered her apartment, closed the door, and leaned against it, processing the unexpected turns her life had taken in such a short time. The next morning brought another surprise. Eleanor was awakened by a phone call on her new cell phone. It was Adrienne Lopez, the social worker from yesterday's meeting. "Mrs. Morgan, I hope I'm not calling too early," Adrienne began. "Not at all," Eleanor assured her, though she was still in her nightgown. "And please, call me Eleanor." "Eleanor? Then I was wondering if you might be available to meet today. Some questions came up after yesterday's discussion that I thought you might be able to help with." Intrigued, Eleanor agreed to a meeting at 11 o'clock. Using the car service app as Angela had taught her, she arranged transportation and was ready, dressed in a comfortable but presentable outfit, when the car arrived. Adrian had suggested a small cafe near the hotel, casual and quiet enough for conversation. When Eleanor arrived, she found not only Adrian waiting, but also Michael Carter, the financial advisor, and two other professionals she hadn't met before, a healthcare consultant and a community organizer specializing in senior issues. "Hope you don't mind the expanded group," Adrian said as she made introductions. "After you left yesterday, George suggested we bring in some additional expertise, and everyone was eager to hear your insights directly." Eleanor felt a momentary flutter of nervousness, but quickly steadied herself. These people wanted her input. Her experience had value here. "I'm happy to help in any way I can," she said, taking the seat they had saved for her. For the next 2 hours, the small group engaged in a detailed discussion about the practical needs of seniors living independently. Eleanor shared her observations about transportation challenges, the complications of navigating healthcare systems, the difficulty of home maintenance on fixed incomes, and the increasing isolation that came with age and limited mobility. What impressed her most was how attentively they listened, taking notes and asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest in understanding the issues rather than merely checking boxes for a predetermined program. "One thing we haven't addressed," Eleanor said toward the end of the meeting, "is the matter of dignity. Any program designed to help seniors must preserve their sense of self-worth. Being old doesn't mean being helpless, and assistance shouldn't feel like charity." The healthcare consultant, Dr. Richardson, nodded emphatically. "That's exactly right. Studies consistently show that maintaining a sense of autonomy and dignity significantly impacts health outcomes for older adults. That's why dignity, Hurst would be such an appropriate name for this initiative," Michael commented. "It puts the focus where it belongs." As the meeting concluded, each of the professionals thanked Eleanor personally for her contributions. Dr. Richardson even asked if she would be willing to review some educational materials they were developing for healthcare providers about communicating effectively with elderly patients. "Your perspective would be invaluable," she explained. "Too often these materials are created without input from the very people they're meant to help." Eleanor agreed readily, feeling a growing sense of purpose in these new roles. As she left the cafe, she realized she hadn't thought about her arthritis once during the entire meeting, despite having forgotten to take her morning medication. Engagement, it seemed, was its own kind of pain management. Back at her apartment, Eleanor found herself too energized to settle into her usual afternoon routine of reading or watching television. Instead, she took out her notebook and began expanding on the ideas discussed at the meeting, adding details and nuances that had occurred to her afterward. She was so absorbed in this task that she was startled when her cell phone rang. It was George. "I hear the meeting went well," he said after they had exchanged greetings. "Very well," Eleanor confirmed, "though I suspect you had something to do with organizing it." George chuckled. "I may have suggested that your input would be valuable, but they were already impressed after yesterday. Adrienne called me specifically to say what a difference your practical perspective made." Eleanor felt a warm glow of satisfaction at his words. "It felt good to be useful again," she admitted. "After retirement, after Albert died, well, the world has a way of making you feel increasingly irrelevant as you age." "Which is exactly what we're trying to change," George said firmly. "Listen, Eleanor, I've been thinking about the concern you raised yesterday, about being seen as an object. Of pity if you shared your story." "Yes?" she prompted when he paused. "What if you were more than just a story? What if you were actively involved in shaping how the Foundation presents its message? A board member, perhaps, or an advisor with a formal role?" Eleanor was momentarily speechless. Me, on a board of directors? George, I don't have any experience with that sort of thing. Experience can be acquired, George countered. What can't be taught is the wisdom that comes from living through the very situations this foundation aims to address. Besides, you were an educator for nearly 4 decades. You know how to communicate complex ideas, how to advocate for needs, how to work within systems while pushing for change. Put that way, the proposition seemed less outlandish. Still, Eleanor hesitated. It would be a significant commitment. It would, George agreed, but I think you'd find it rewarding. And between the car service and that new phone, logistics shouldn't be an obstacle. Let me think about it, Eleanor said, wanting to consider the offer carefully rather than being swept along by enthusiasm. Of course, George replied easily. No pressure, just an idea to consider. After they had chatted a bit longer about his upcoming tour dates and her plans for the week, they said their goodbyes. Eleanor sat in her armchair, the phone still in, her hand contemplating the unexpected path her life had taken. 6 months later, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. Gone was the faded cardigan and worn slacks that had been her daily uniform. In their place was a well-tailored pantsuit in a rich burgundy that complemented her silver hair, now styled in a sleek bob rather than the practical but uninspired cut she'd maintained for years. But the changes went beyond mere appearance. The woman in the mirror stood straighter, her eyes brighter, her expression animated with purpose rather than resigned to routine. At 79, Eleanor Morgan had undergone a transformation that few would have predicted, least of all herself. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her reflection. "Eleanor, the car's here whenever you're ready," called a familiar voice. "Coming, George," she replied, picking up her leather portfolio, another gift from her unexpected friend, filled with notes for today's presentation. She emerged from the bedroom to find George Starit waiting in her living room, or rather, what had once been her living room. The apartment itself had undergone nearly as dramatic a transformation as its occupant. The worn furniture had been replaced with pieces that were both attractive and accommodating to aging bodies. The lighting had been improved, the kitchen updated with accessible features, and most significantly, the bathroom had been renovated to include safety bars and a walk-in shower. All these changes had come gradually over the past 6 months, as Eleanor's involvement with what was now officially called Dignity First had deepened. Each modification had been presented not as charity, but as practical research, testing the very home adaptations the foundation would eventually help provide to other seniors. "You look wonderful," George said with genuine admiration. "Ready to inspire the troops?" Eleanor smiled, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation rather than anxiety that now preceded her public speaking engagements. "As ready as I'll ever be. Though I still think you should be the one giving the keynote. You're the draw, after all." George shook his head firmly. "People come because of my name on the invitation, true, but they leave committed to the cause. Because of your words, Eleanor, you have something I could never offer: authenticity. You've lived this story." They made their way down the hallway toward the elevator, another change in Eleanor's daily life. 3 months ago, the building's ancient, frequently out-of-service elevator had been completely modernized, an anonymous donation that the landlord had suspiciously received shortly after George's first visit. Now all the residents, many elderly like Eleanor, could avoid the treacherous stairs that had caused several falls over the years. As they descended to the ground floor, Eleanor reflected on the whirlwind her life had become. Monthly board meetings, for Dignity First, speaking engagements at fundraisers, consulting on program design, even interviews with select media outlets, all while maintaining her newfound friendship with George, who called without fail twice a week when on tour and visited regularly during his breaks. The foundation had exceeded everyone's expectations, raising substantial funds and launching pilot programs in 3 cities. Its mission to help seniors maintain their independence and dignity through practical support services had resonated with donors large and small. Today's event was the official launch of a national expansion, with plans to establish programs in 20 additional cities over the next 2 years. Outside, a sleek black sedan waited at the curb. The driver, Marcus, had become a familiar face, transporting Eleanor to her various foundation-related activities. He greeted her with a warm smile as George held the door for her. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan. Big day today." "Indeed it is, Marcus," Eleanor replied, settling into the comfortable back seat. "And how are your mother's new grab bars working out?" Marcus beamed. "She says they've changed her life. No more anxiety about getting in and out of the tub. She asked me to thank you again for connecting her with the program." This was another unexpected joy in Eleanor's new life. The ability to help others directly, to connect people with resources, to see tangible improvements in lives other than her own. For all the grand scale of Dignity First's ambitions, these individual successes remained the most rewarding. As the car pulled away from the curb, George turned to Eleanor with a slightly hesitant expression that immediately caught her attention. In their months of friendship, she had learned to read his moods with surprising accuracy. "What is it?" she asked. "You've got that look, the one that means you're about to suggest something you think I might resist." George laughed, shaking his head in amused resignation. "Am I that transparent?" "Only to me," Eleanor assured him with a smile. "Now, out with it." "I've been thinking," George began, choosing his words carefully. "The tour schedule for next year is going to be pretty grueling. 40 cities in 5 months. I'm not getting any younger, Eleanor, and those bus rides and hotel rooms start to wear on a man my age." Eleanor nodded sympathetically. Despite his remarkably youthful appearance and energy, George was in his late 60s, an age when most people were settling into retirement rather than maintaining the demanding schedule of a touring musician. "Maybe it's time to cut back," she suggested. "You've certainly earned the right to slow down a bit." "That's just it," George continued. "I don't want to cut back on performing. It's what keeps me young, connects me to the fans who've supported me all these years. But the travel, the logistics, that's the exhausting part." He paused, seeming to gather his courage for whatever proposal was coming. What if there was a way to make it all more manageable, more companionable? Eleanor raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate. "I've been renovating a tour bus, a second one just for me, separate from the band and crew," George explained. "More like a rolling apartment than a typical tour bus, comfortable, private." "Sounds sensible," Eleanor commented, still unsure where this was leading. George met her eyes directly. "I was wondering if you might consider joining me for parts of the tour, not as a guest, but as a traveling ambassador for Dignity First. We could schedule foundation events in many of the same cities where I'm performing, maximize the impact, reach more potential donors and partners." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Me? On tour?" "Not the whole tour," George clarified quickly. "Just select cities, for as long or short as you'd like. The bus has 2 completely private suites, a full kitchen, all the comforts of home." He smiled. "And the company wouldn't be half bad." Before Eleanor could respond, he continued. "The foundation would cover all expenses, of course. It would be official business, expanding our reach, connecting with local senior communities, identifying regional needs." His expression grew more earnest, Think about it, Eleanor. Your story, your perspective, combined with the platform my concerts provide, we could reach so many more people. Eleanor sat in stunned silence, turning the proposition over in her mind. A year ago, the very idea would have seemed absurd, impossible. Now somehow it felt like a natural extension of the path she had been traveling these past months. "I'd have to think about it," she finally said. "It's a big step." George nodded, clearly relieved she hadn't rejected the idea outright. "Of course. No rush to decide. The tour doesn't start for 3 months." They spent the remainder of the drive discussing the day's event, reviewing key points of Eleanor's speech and going over the latest updates on Foundation programs. By the time they arrived at the convention center where the launch was being held, the tour bus proposal had been set aside for later consideration. The event itself was everything they had hoped for. Over 400 attendees, donors, potential partners, media representatives, and most importantly, seniors and caregivers who might benefit from the Foundation's programs. Eleanor, once terrified of public speaking, delivered her keynote address with confidence and heart, sharing her journey from humiliation at the grocery store to renewal of purpose through dignity first. "Dignity isn't a luxury," she told the rapt audience. "It's a necessity, as essential as food or shelter. When we help seniors maintain their independence, we aren't just extending their ability to live in their own homes. We're extending their sense of self, their connection to the world, their belief that they still matter." By the time she concluded, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, including her own. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes, led by George, who looked at her with undisguised pride as she made her way back to her seat beside him. The remainder of the event was a whirlwind of presentations, panel discussions, and networking. Eleanor found herself approached repeatedly by attendees wanting to share their own stories, ask her advice, or simply express gratitude for giving. Voice to experiences so many had felt, but few had articulated publicly. By late afternoon, as the event wound down, Eleanor was exhausted, but exhilarated. She sat in a quiet corner of the now emptying hall, watching George across the room as he spoke with a group of potential donors. His charisma was undeniable, his passion for the cause evident in every gesture, every earnest expression. Yet for all his celebrity, there was a genuine humility in how he directed attention toward the Foundation's work rather than himself. Eleanor's reflections were interrupted by a familiar voice that sent an immediate chill through her. "Mrs. Morgan, is that really you?" She looked up to see Jason, the cashier from Harris Grocery, standing before her. 6 months had changed him as well, though in less positive ways. His once confident posture was now hesitant, his expression anxious rather than arrogant. He wore a uniform she didn't recognize, a different store perhaps. "Hello, Jason," she said calmly, surprised by her own lack of resentment. The humiliation that had once felt so raw had faded, replaced by a detached pity for the young man who had once wielded such cruel power over her emotions. I saw your picture on the program," he stammered. "I couldn't believe it was the same person. You look so different." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Circumstances change us all, one way or another." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "I've been wanting to apologize. What I did that day, it was inexcusable. I was fired the next day, and I deserved it." He swallowed hard. "I've thought about it a lot since then." Eleanor studied him, seeing not the arrogant young man who had humiliated her, but someone who had learned a difficult lesson. "Apology accepted, Jason. We all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them." Relief washed over his features. "Thank you. That's generous of you." He hesitated, then added, "The Foundation's work sounds amazing. My grandmother, she lives alone, struggles with a lot of the same things you talked about in your speech." Eleanor reached into her portfolio and removed one of her business cards, another novelty in her new life. Have her contact us. We're expanding locally first, before the national rollout. She might qualify for our pilot program. Jason accepted the card with a grateful nod. I will, thank you. He began to turn away, then paused. You know, you changed my life that day, not in a good way at first, losing my job, feeling like the world's biggest jerk. But eventually, it made me think about how I treat people, especially older people. He gestured to his uniform. I work at Sunrise Senior Living now. It's less pay, but it feels like I'm making up for things in a way. With a final nod, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Eleanor to ponder the unexpected encounter. She had never considered that Jason might have experienced his own transformation in the aftermath of that day at the grocery store. Was that who I think it was? George asked, appearing at her side with 2 cups of coffee. Eleanor nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. Jason, yes, he came to apologize. George settled into the chair beside her. And did you accept? I did, Eleanor confirmed. Holding on to anger serves no purpose. Besides, he seems to have learned from the experience. George studied her with admiration. You continue to amaze me, Eleanor Morgan. Your capacity for forgiveness, for growth, for embracing change at a time of life when most people resist it with all their might. It's remarkable. Eleanor smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee warming her hands. Perhaps that's the true gift you've given me, George. Not the practical help or the opportunities, valuable as they are, but the chance to discover that I'm not done growing, not done contributing, not done living fully. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the last of the attendees filtering out of the hall. Finally, Eleanor turned to George with a decisive expression. About your proposal, the tour bus, the foundation ambassadorship. George raised an eyebrow. Yes? I'll do it, Eleanor said firmly. Not every city, mind you. These old bones need their rest. But select stops, yes. I think it could be valuable for the foundation. And, she added with a small smile, I find I'm not quite ready to settle back into a quiet routine just yet. George's face lit up with genuine pleasure. You won't regret it, Eleanor. We'll make it comfortable, productive, and I promise, at the first sign that it's too much, we'll get you straight home. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey of the past 6 months. From a humiliating moment at a grocery checkout to a new purpose, new friendships, and now an entirely new adventure on the horizon. What struck her most, however, wasn't the external changes in her circumstances, substantial as they were. It was the internal transformation, the rediscovery of her own worth, her own voice, her own capacity to continue growing and contributing well into what society often dismissed as the twilight years. Ready to head back? George asked, offering his arm as they walked toward the exit. Eleanor took it, smiling up at him. Ready for whatever comes next, she replied, and meant it with all her heart. Outside, Marcus waited with the car, and beyond him, the future, uncertain as always, but now filled with possibilities rather than limitations. As they drove away from the convention center, Eleanor found herself thinking of all the seniors like her, isolated by circumstances, diminished by society's perceptions, yet still full of untapped potential. One grocery store encounter had changed her life. Through dignity first, perhaps she could help change others, and in doing so, continue to discover new dimensions of herself. Not despite her age, but because of it, because of all the wisdom and resilience that her 79 years had given her. A penny for your thoughts, George asked, echoing his question from months before. Eleanor turned to him with a smile that held both serenity and excitement. I was just thinking that life has a way of surprising you, right when you think all the surprises are behind you, George nodded. understanding in his eyes. The best songs are the ones with unexpected bridges, leading you somewhere you never thought the melody could go. As the car carried them through the evening traffic, Eleanor Morgan felt a profound gratitude, not just for the material improvements in her life or the renewed sense of purpose, but for the simple, transformative power of being truly seen, truly heard, truly valued. From humiliation to dignity, from isolation to connection, from invisibility to recognition, the journey had been remarkable, and it wasn't over yet. In fact, in many ways, it felt as if it had only just begun.